This evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you the Reverend Dr. Christopher Seitz as this year's Hayward Lecturer. Dr. Seitz is just taking up a new position as Professor of Biblical Interpretation at Wycliffe College in Toronto. This addition to Wycliffe College is not only exciting for the college, but is exciting for those of us who are in biblical studies, especially Old Testament studies here in Canada. He earned his Bachelor of Arts from North Carolina State University, a Master of Theological Studies from Virginia Theological Seminary, and both his Master of Sacred Theology and a PhD from Yale University, where he studied with Brevard Childs, whose influence I think will be evident in certain ways in what it is that Dr. Seitz does this evening. Dr. Seitz is a man of the church. He's an ordained Episcopalian priest and has served in parishes in various capacities in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Germany, Scotland, and he is now the Sunday evening preacher at St. Matthew's Anglican Church in Riverdale area in Toronto. However, it's not as a man of the church that we call him specifically to this lecture series, but rather as an Old Testament scholar. For 10 years before his recent move, Dr. Seitz was Professor of Old Testament and Theological Studies at St. Mary's College in St. Andrews, Scotland, where I received my PhD. Unfortunately, Dr. Seitz was not there at that time. Before that, he held a position similar to it at Yale Divinity College, where he taught for 11 years. He's written numerous articles occurring in collections and in journals such as Journal of Biblical Literature, Biblische Zeitschrift, Vetus Testamentum, Biblical Theology, Interpretation, but also Christian Century, Calvin Theological Journal, Pro Ecclesia, a wide variety of kinds of journals. And he has written numerous books, some of which are for sale out here in the back, and I commend them to you. I'll just give you a sense of some of the interests that he has. In 1989, he published Theology in Conflict, Reactions to the Exile in the Book of Jeremiah. In 1991, from Fortress, Zion's Final Destiny, the development of the Book of Isaiah, a reassessment of Isaiah 36 to 39. In 1998, from Erdman's Word Without End, the Old Testament as Abiding Theological Witness, a copy of which is available for sale. He's published 2 volumes on the book of Isaiah, and his most recent book, Prophecy and Hermeneutics, toward a new introduction of the prophets, from Baker Academic, same publisher as his next book, at least from this series, will be coming out in. So he has published in a wide variety of areas, many or some of which I have not referred to at all in my summary of books. This lecture series is going to form yet another book, and it will come out in the same series that some previous Hayward Lectures have come out in, the Acadia series in Bible and Theology. Dr. Seitz is a prominent Old Testament scholar, and as one can see from his involvement in the church and from his writings, he is one who brings together informed research on biblical text for the academy, but with a concern for the theological value of that research for the church. Last year, I spent time at St. Mary's College in Scotland for my sabbatical leave, and there I learned from doctoral students that he's an exciting lecturer, and his classes, I was told by a colleague, were well subscribed to there by undergraduates. I also heard from the doctoral students that he was a favored supervisor of doctoral dissertations. So, it is with pleasure and anticipation that I invite Dr. Seitz to the podium to deliver the first of his lectures, The Law and the Prophets, Order, Scope, and Implications, in his series entitled The Achievement of Association, the Theological Significance of Early Canonical Formation. In keeping with the weather that we've given him, please give him a warm greeting.
Thanks, Glenn. That was a very kind set of remarks. It's good to be with you. Particularly nice to have this weather. I'm not from Canada, and I'm from Scotia, I suppose, most recently. Alta Scotia, maybe one should say. Don't look for a Scottish accent. I don't have one, but it's just great to be here. I've known some of the previous speakers, Lee Keck's an old friend of mine, and Tom Wright and others, so it's a real pleasure to be with you. I do hope you'll stay for the 3 lectures. I know that this is a busy time, I suspect, in your term, but these lectures build one upon another. The one I'm doing tonight is, I think, actually the most ambitious of the bunch. I think the others are a little more straightforward. And let me apologize a bit ahead of time for that, but I'll try to keep the thing moving right along. I'm assuming a fair amount of background, but I would also say that one of the things I'm assuming is that the order of the canon of the Bible is a particular lens on its interpretation. And that's not necessarily the way any of us have been trained. I could ask my New Testament or Old Testament students simply to tell me what the books of the Bible are, and many of them really wouldn't know, and they wouldn't think that it was a determinative factor in how they actually interpret individual passages. Does it matter that Amos is after Hosea or before it, and so forth and so on? So I'm assuming some of this as though it's a sort of ground level, and yet for many of us, it's not the training that we've had. And I often find that this is the case. It may be that you get some good Sunday school trained people who can tell you what the letters of Paul are and so forth and so on, but very soon in the training that they get, that is of no importance. And increasingly, it's not clear that anybody even has that kind of foundation. And teaching makes for a special challenge, I think, in the times in which we live. If they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone is raised from the dead. This passage from Luke is one of the most remarkable passages in all of the New Testament. It speaks of the sufficiency of the Scriptures of Israel to accomplish what even a resurrection from the dead cannot improve on. It's spoken by Jesus, who will return from the dead, and who as his first act will open these same Scriptures and show himself to be both teacher and main theme. Our concern in these lectures is related to this key passage. It takes as its wider point of departure the specific question of the material form of the Scriptures of Israel at the time of the formation of the New Testament. Some have argued that reference to the law and the prophets, Moses and the prophets in the New Testament, means that the third section of the canon, the division called the writings, is not yet stable. This Torah, prophets, writings. Luke's later reference to Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms in Luke 24 confirms and does not contradict this point, according to such a view. Others have argued that the phrase, the law and the prophets, means that the law only was stable, and that all the other books were called prophetic, and that a tripartite division is not yet in force. Moreover, on this view, the non-Mosaic books are diverse, without fixed sequence, open in scope, and inclusive of other apocryphal books, as they'll be called. A wide religious literature without definite bounds is the way one scholar put it. The determination of the Old Testament canon, such as it was not made until sometime after the New Testament, according to this view, and it was caught up in the same struggle of the New Testament to achieve its own canonical status, ordered shape, and logic. I take this to be the view of John Barton, James Barr, Albert Sundberg, and most recently Craig Allert at Trinity Western. The position taken in these lectures is that this popular reconstruction is faulty at key points. First, it misunderstands the unique achievement of the prophetic division of the canon as a division different in kind from either the law or the writings. That is, this main middle section. Second, it makes closure the most fundamental aspect of canonical authority, when there are other ways of considering this key feature of the Scriptures of Israel. The law and the prophets, I will argue, is a grammar. That is, the means by which the language of Israel's scriptures makes its voice fundamentally heard. And third, the writings, the third division of the Canon, work in conjunction with this grammar, and their precise number and order is not crucial on the same terms. The character of the writings must be properly grasped if the issue of closure and scope is to be understood, and my third lecture will be on the writings. Finally, I'll argue that the popular reconstruction misunderstands two features at work in the law and the prophets as the grammar of Israel's scriptural inheritance. First, the formation of the New Testament has been affected by the Old Testament, not simply in the area of intellectual or religious background. This is the view of Tom Wright and others. Nor simply in the area of its citing of Old Testament texts, the use of the Old in the New then being a fundamental way of the church to think about its appropriation of the Old Testament. This is the view of Richard Hayes and Francis Watson. Rather, the law and the prophets, in its ordered form, provides key categories of hermeneutics and reapplication, affiliation and association, critical for the formation of the New Testament. Appreciation of these categories is essential if we're to understand the implications of the New Testament's canonical form, especially the fourfold gospel collection, Acts, and the diverse letters of Paul. The influence of the Old Testament's canonical form on the New Testament's canonical form has not been sufficiently appreciated. And this is because the Old Testament's canonical form, until recently, was also not particularly appreciated. There is a further aspect in my remarks. In the early church fathers, appeal is made to the rule of faith. Central to understanding the rule is the evolving and unfinished character of the New Testament canon, and the need in such a period to have recourse to a stable scriptural witness, which lays out the grammar of the God of Israel and his people. The law and the prophets, which will in time be called the Old Testament, was viewed as a privileged, stable witness against which the claims of the gospel were tested and shown to have been established from of old. This was a distinctive Christian accomplishment, but it was made on the basis of a stable witness whose sense was taken to be plain or figural both. The rule of faith establishes the providential work of God in Christ, in creation, in the promise to the patriarchs, in the word spoken in law and prophet, in prediction, type, and moral example. An account of the law and the prophets which emphasizes diversity, lack of closure, and no ordered form will fail properly to assess the appeal to the rule of faith and its implications for the formation of the Christian canon. The New Testament takes form and derives its authority not only in respect of the apostolic memory or eyewitnessing, a popular theme now from my colleague Richard Balcom at St. Andrews, where memory and eyewitnessing is crucial. Rather, crucial for the formation of the New Testament and its canonical logic is a proper understanding of the law and the prophets, upon which this logic is based in the confession of Jesus Christ as Son of God in accordance with the Scriptures, as the Creed has it. Those who believe that the Old Testament's canonical character is intimately tied up with that of the New Testament are correct, but they have the influence running in the wrong direction. Two images may help explain what is at stake. In Charleston, South Carolina, where I grew up, stretching over the wide Cooper River was a remarkable steel bridge, particularly for those of us who had to drive on it. It was very narrow. It had to be high enough to accommodate great shipping vessels, and it had to gain its height very quickly, rising as it did from sea level. The Cooper River Bridge in time had to be replaced, as bridges do. A massive new structure was conceived, with its starting point on the north side of the river now placed at a considerable distance back and joined with the interstate highway system, which had in the meantime been developed. For the period of time of this new bridge's construction, the old bridge continued to do its work. The new bridge slowly took form with respect to it, over it, in time dwarfing it and showing it to be clearly the bridge of a former day. The pylons for the new bridge were placed with reference to the old. When the new bridge was finished, the old was allowed section by section until all was done to fall into the sea. Anyone who recalls the old bridge knows how influential it was in constructing the new bridge. In theory, the old bridge could have been retained and traffic allowed to use it, perhaps for special events, antique cars, and so forth. But its chief use was for traffic from an older day and for help in constructing a new bridge. Those with special awareness of engineering made a good deal out of the indispensability of the old, and tribute to it was not without its special character. Occasionally one heard that the old bridge was an eyesore, dangerous, and always in need of demolition, but these voices were not major ones. A more appropriate way to understand the old bridge or the Old Testament would not have been to leave it standing, for the basic analogy is faulty, and I hope you see that. So a second image suggests itself for your imagination. One may think that in our day there is an allergy to things old, as against newer models. This is, of course, a legacy in our consumer West, until it comes to golf, or Ivy League schools, or single malt scotch, and so forth. If people were required to walk on their knees to play golf at the old course in St. Andrews, they would do it. If you told them they could play the new course, even if it might be more challenging, they would balk. Now, the old course is actually too short to be played, unsurprisingly given its age and the space-age equipment now used to launch space-age golf balls. But adjustments have been made in the old course. The tee boxes are placed back as far as possible, sometimes on adjacent golf links. The point is, what is new must take its bearing by reference to what is old, or one is not really participating on the terms desired. Here the concern is with incorporation with the original game for outsiders, both temporally and even religiously distinct, if one takes golf to be a game played with religious fervor by Scots and shared only reluctantly with others. Now, this analogy fails as well, but it does illustrate something of the challenge of properly assessing the character of the Old Testament and the achievement of a New Testament canonical witness, the second part of which uses the Old, refers to the Old, and allows the Old also a word of its own by the simple fact of the retention of it in a given form, unlike that bridge that fell into the Cooper River. And so here's what is at stake in the lectures I propose: the given character, the material form, and the influence of that first witness, which in time would be called not the Law and the Prophets, but the Old Testament. One technical note before I begin. I will refer to the tripartite form as either the Hebrew text or the Masoretic text, even though the actual work of the Masoretes in conceiving of this form is a later development. That is, the Torah prophets writing tripartite form. I do this because of the lists that emerge. This Hebrew form retains its tripartite character without very much alteration. even though we can spot minor divergences in the writings, because these books move within the division on occasion. Josephus refers to a strange list, for example. The tripartite, however, is not preserved in printed Bibles, such as the ones you will have most likely in your library and in your prayer desk, except in some Jewish publications, or in the Biblical Hebraica Stuttgartensia, that is the technical Hebrew text that Glenn and others use when they teach people Hebrew. The law, the prophets, and the writings, the Tanakh, as it is called, presents a challenging form for our interpretation, and I will be speaking of this form as an achievement. This is especially true in the prophetic division of this tripartite division. 12 minor prophets existed, as we know, from earliest times at Qumran and in Ben Sira as a one-book anthology in a settled sequence. Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel are combined with this to make up the latter prophets. The historical-looking books of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, the former prophets, comprise the first subdivision of this prophetic canon. The writings are not redistributed into new divisions, but follow with their own integrity, variegated though it may be. But because English printed Bibles do not preserve this order, it's not likely to be familiar to you. The challenge for me, however, is not to do with unfamiliarity when it comes to alternative lists and orders. Quadripartite is not just a mouthful and so unwieldy, it is not accurate, and it obscures the fact that the convention of most modern printed Bibles, with law, history, poetical, and prophetical books, has no real precursor in antiquity. I have a handout that I'll supply tomorrow where you can see this clearly. Struck me, actually, in doing research for this, how stunning it was there is not one list of the biblical books in antiquity with Malachi, the last book. I could not find one. Several attempts have been made to describe the theological achievement of this fourfold order, but one of them frankly acknowledges that this achievement would not have been grasped because, in fact, it's not preserved in antiquity in any of the major Greek or Septuagint forms known to the church or the synagogue. In consequence, to speak of a fourfold order, this one, Torah, historical, poetical, prophetical, the ones we're used to in our modern printed conventions, to speak of this as an alternative sequence actually gives too much away. It's hard then to know what to call these alternative listings, except to call them diverse alternative listings. I will have a handout tomorrow that shows how this is so. One final note about the character of scholarship, especially in modern Old Testament studies. I would guess that more than 30 monographs, long, tedious scholarly treatments, and a host of articles and collections of essays have been devoted recently to the study of the minor prophets. Probably the most electrifying collection of writings at Qumran alongside Isaiah, but maybe less so for you and me. Interest in the coherence of the book of the 12, the minor prophets, has surpassed that focused on interpreting the book of Isaiah as a 66-chapter whole, a bit of research I was involved with for a decade. I'll only refer to this exciting work in piecemeal fashion in my talks with you all. But this view has gained wide acceptance as an appropriate model for interpreting the minor prophets, both as individual books, but also interpreting one another in their given form in a collection. The 12 is a collection. The 12 are individual books. Both of these things are true. Moreover, a model which recasts them in a historical order, the way I was trained in seminary. Start with Amos, end with Jonah, or Malachi, something like that. This model reads them as individual works in an alleged historical context. And this is good for what it is, but it fails to press on to ask whether there are key interpretative, hermeneutical issues that also deserve the word historical, but they are more in the process of maturation of form than in the origins of these books. Indeed, one recent New Testament commentator has had the temerity to refer to popular historical approaches as hermeneutically perverse. And see how fashions change. It was one thing in the old days, we get to know who Amos was by himself. Now the question is that really the way we're meant to read these books, or are we supposed to read them in relationship to one another? Yet, as with a lot of things, there's a lag time between this fresh work on the Book of the 12, as is being introduced, and introductions to the prophets. Hence the title of my new book, Toward a New Introduction to the Prophets. There are exceptions. Rolf Rentorf, whose name I will mention, who taught Old Testament at Heidelberg, has a new theology of the Old Testament where the Book of the 12, the minor prophets in their present form, is set forth in a highly imaginative, creative, and illuminating way, but this work at present proves the exception to the rule. The reason for this time lag are neither conspiratorial or high-flying, but have to do with a wide variety of factors, publication trends, and so forth and so on. I won't get into that now, but my book, Prophecy and Hermeneutics, tries to investigate why this is so. Finally, an explanation for my theme. Lectures just don't fall from the sky. I'm aware that Dr. MacDonald, your principal, your president, has written extensively on the Canon, and my former graduate student, Steve Chapman, published an impressive study that he refers to frequently called The Law and the Prophets. I was privileged to think through and alongside this student in his work on that, and I have two graduate students I've left at St. Andrews who are working on the third division of the Canon, the writings. I'm aware that certain conservative, theologically conservative biblical scholars have sought to defend a closed and fixed Hebrew Bible with every book in its present place at the time of the formation of the New Testament. But I'm not sure this is winning assent, and an impasse still exists. In my view, there has been insufficient attention to internal editorial and associative moves that need to be factored into any assessment of the canon and its emergence. But it was probably the untimely passing of my teacher, my colleague at Yale, and close friend Brevard Childs, which pressed me to adopt for the Hayward Lectures a theme which touched on canon. At the service of celebration and thanksgiving at Marquand Chapel last month, Lee Keck, who gave these lectures, wrote these words about Childs. It's not surprising, therefore, that if there is one thing for which Childs is known, it is his emphasis on canon. More than anyone else, he insisted on exploring the theological consequences of the nature and history of the Christian Two Testament canon. To make his case, he redefined the words canon and canonization. For him, canon refers to much more than lists of books. That's probably the way it sounds on many of our ears. It refers much more than lists of books. It really refers to the long process by which the Bible we have and the texts it contains came to be what they are now. Canonization is not something that was done to the writings. Rather, some aspect of canonizing was occurring at every stage of the whole Bible-making process. My concern in these lectures is to trace out the way the prophetic division of the Hebrew Bible was a canonical achievement of the first order. This achievement did not come at the closing phases, but was there at the very beginning as the prophetic books began to take form. It will be a view I hold very strongly that Amos and Hosea were shaped by the pupils of both and never were heard as independent books. The law and the prophets are the fundamental grammar of the scriptures of Israel, and the third division of the canon, the writings, defers to that grammar and works alongside of it in its own special way. The New Testament has as well its own character of deference, though it is of a highly specific nature given the subject matter with which it is dealing, the sending of the eternal Son in accordance and in fulfillment of all that went on before, as the Creed says, in accordance with the Old Testament, the Scriptures. If one follows the scholarly literature, it's clear that a cottage industry has grown up in recent years on the topic of canon, which is doubtless why Dr. MacDonald and others have been engaged with it. Among other things, this has meant fresh attention to the final form of the text and its relationship to the development of a biblical book. Many of these focused on questions of authorial intention below and behind the received text. Are there 3 Isaiahs and also an intelligible book of Isaiah in its present form? Or if you're on the New Testament side of the canon, is there a Q and a special Luke, but also a gospel form in its present shape, with 4 Gospels, with John in meaningful position, separating Acts from Luke? This is the kind of canonical question that's presently being raised. I would call this the theological or hermeneutical aspect of interest in the canon, but Anglo-Saxon scholarship has also shown great interest in the historical and material questions. Qumran, when did the canon close? These sorts of concrete questions. On this front, a serious impasse exists over the question of the stability of the Old Testament at the time of the New, and whether it's possible to describe an Old Testament which is constraining, informing, or otherwise declaring the proper theological horizon of the New Testament, both for those who have composed the New Testament, if also not for the mission of Jesus Christ himself. Was there an Old Testament canon in the form of a closed collection of scriptural writings with authority, or was the Old Testament canon a consequence either of Jewish convictions or of the Christian church after decisions about the New Testament were made? This touches on an old chestnut. Does the church create the Bible or receive it? This belongs in that same nexus of theological concerns. It had divided Protestants and Roman Catholics, for example. If, on the other hand, one argues that the Old Testament exercised pressure on the formation of New Testament convictions, and that a stable, authoritative canon existed at the time of the New Testament, there are a lot of challenges to be faced. How many writings were in this canon? Does a canon need to be closed in order to be a canon? In what order were the writings arranged? Many have argued that use of a term like canon means stable, closed, and in fixed order. Anything less than this should be called not canon, but scripture, or religious writings. Here the obvious question is, what is scripture if it is less than canon, but more than edifying literature? Be it the Athenian times, Homer, Dante, Augustine, Calvin, take your pick. Can't a canon have authority independent of closure? These lectures will be investigating this question, but will operate with one significant piece of information not usually incorporated into discussions of the canon. There has been recent interest, as I have indicated, in the Book of the 12. Here one is made conscious of the reality of affiliation and association within this diverse witness. These witnesses, the minor prophets, become what they do not by decisions of exclusion or closure. They gradually seek relationship and association with one another. And at a period of time, they simply cease from their labors. We can see this clearly, and I'll go into this in more detail tomorrow, in the case of Hosea and Amos. And in other places, the decisions are less obvious in terms of interpreting them, but they're equally important, as in the placements of Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah, three very late witnesses which have nevertheless not been placed at the end of the book of the 12, but right down in the middle. The achievement of the book of the 12 is enormous, and once it reaches a final stability of form, it resists any further intrusion or development. We know this now most clearly from Qumran, where we have all the books of the minor prophets represented, and they are already in a particular fixed form. Rarely do we have all 12, but where we have instances where you can see 2 or 3 in order, they are in the order of the Masoretic text. I hope then that the title for my lectures is slowly becoming clear. By early canon formation, I mean that it is entirely possible to conceive of canon and scriptural authority in phases prior to the final closing of writings. Let me turn then to the challenge of order. My concern at this initial point is in tracking the significance of order, the way order works in the Bible, any order, when it comes to a standard introduction to the Old Testament. In 1979, my colleague Brevard Childs, then my teacher, wrote a book called Introduction to the Old Testament as Scripture. That last 2 words got him into a lot of trouble. But in many ways, the groundbreaking character of his work was as much to do with the way individual books made sense in their final form, but also with his theological reflections on the nature of the structure of the canon and the fact that it exists in this tripartite form. His work offered a shift in, if nothing more, than his decision to treat the individual works in the order of the Masoretic, that is, of the order of the tripartite canon. So long as a sequential, genetic, historical account was a priority in standard Old Testament works, where you figured out which books you thought were first and you worked in that way, the question of the order of the canonical writings was largely irrelevant in respect of organization. One usually treated canon as the last thing that you did in an Old Testament interpretation class. A canonical order in either the Greek or the Hebrew forms, tripartite or fourfold, is not straightforwardly historical. So it was that a decision to abandon these forms, made in the 19th century, affected both of them equally. You'd be hard-pressed to find any textbook introducing either the New or the Old Testament according to their present canonical orders. And if you did, at least in the Old Testament, you would have to decide which one you were using. The implications of structuring in this way, the historical way, are close to hand. A quick survey of introduction courses to the Old Testament would probably show the significance of something like the exile. Everything in the first semester would be before the exile. Everything in the second semester would be after the exile. And yet this conforms to no canonical organization. Let me choose another example. Rolf Rentorf, who's written prolifically on the Old Testament, many of his works are now translated into English, was also committed, like Childs, to treating the received forms of books, and therefore he reached conclusions satisfactory to him that an organization needed to deal with the tripartite order. I suspect in Rentorf's case, as a German, much of this had to do with the Lutheran Church's concern to speak to the Jewish community. I think that was probably animating Rentorf in his concern. His reasons for using the form of the Tanakh, the tripartite form, had probably to do with his sensitivity in Germany to the relationship between the Christian church and the Jewish synagogue. In the course of his treatment, however, he will note the effect of divergent arrangements found in our familiar fourfold organization of English printed Bibles, and he'll attempt to give an account of this. The impression this gives, probably not wrongly, is that the fourfold order is derivative. In his most recent work, Rentorf has devoted himself and joined a group of larger scholars trying to read the minor prophets in their present form. By contrast, Childs did not pursue the intention of the final form of the minor prophets in his introduction. It's a little unclear to me why he did not do that, since he was committed to treating them in their present order. The explanation that he gave me at one point was he had enough to do simply to deal with the final form of books, and he left untouched the question of their relationship one to another. But as I'll show tomorrow, there are pregnant observations in Childs that tie up quite nicely, particularly in his reading of Hosea with this newer Book of the 12 research. But there's one exception to this that I think needs to be pointed out. Deuteronomy, the last book of the present Pentateuch, Childs argued was an integral part of the Pentateuch and not the introduction to what was being called the Deuteronomistic history. That is, the books that run from Joshua to the end of Kings. It's been made clear that Deuteronomy seems to be more closely affiliated with these historical books than with the Torah of Moses. And Childs argued that the decision to separate Deuteronomy from the Deuteronomistic history was for hermeneutical reasons, that the book of Deuteronomy tells successive generations how they are to stand in relationship to Torah. That's its effect, and therefore its position separating the law and the prophets is intentionally positioned. This is critical because the New Testament and almost all citations in the period in question refer to the Old Testament as the law and the prophets, thus revealing how deeply rooted in the literature is this grammar. Let me turn then to another example of a textbook that I suspect was the most published, most widely read textbook of its era, Bernard Anderson's Understanding the Old Testament. How many have read it? Bernard Anderson told me one time, went through 32 editions. He bought 3 or 4 summer homes on the basis of that book. I would that we all could have such luck. Anderson's famously successful Understanding the Old Testament offers an introduction that is unashamedly in a historical and non-canonical presentation. The reason for this was at the time a self-evidence. Drawing on the general picture of the Old Testament studies at the time, Anderson concluded that Israel's recital of faith, the mighty acts of God, as they were called in that period, were at the bedrock of Israel's self-understanding. That is, Israel's self-understanding was event-oriented, and therefore one needed to begin the introduction with the event par excellence, namely deliverance from Egypt. Therefore, creation was moved into a very different place in such a treatment, if treated at all, because the mighty acts of God were not canonical, but rather belonged to this recital of Israel's faith, which Anderson felt as though was historically the most appropriate. What happens with Genesis? I don't know. You get around to it when you get around to it. It's not an appropriate lens on how to interpret the Old Testament. Now, we can all be judged later by our decisions. It would have been rare for introductions of this period to have done otherwise. In what other ways they may have departed from Anderson's general approach. Assumed, though not necessarily argued, was that the presentation of the material was in the gift of the author and had nothing to do with the material form itself. If one goes back further into the 19th century, this assumption is by no means self-evident. The point is that the historical recasting of the theology of the Old Testament turned on a highly imaginative and creative set of assumptions. Anderson believed there was an early creed that comprised Israel's self-identity. That's an imaginative construct, but it doesn't conform to anything in the canonical form. I keep in my office a classic from this period. It's right over my desk. It's called The Bible in Order, which makes the point nicely. One could have thought you'd just take the Bible down. But of course, the Bible in Order is a recasting of the Bible according to the principles of its historical development. In a recent set of reflections on another really epochal character, Gerhard von Rad. Again, the person who taught me the Old Testament in some ways, Rentorf, who is the student of von Rad, classified his great teacher. Would that again, he had much more impressive person in many ways than Bernard Anderson. Rentorf classified von Rad, according to his now honed canonical instincts, semi-canonical. What he meant was that von Rad's order of presentation, again, probably the most impressive, influential account of the Old Testament available, still in print, reprinted, I noticed, with introductions by Walter Brueggemann. I mean, you can hardly get any higher than that. In this presentation, the theology of the Old Testament, Rentorf subjected von Rad to a set of criterion, namely the canonical shape, that von Rad himself probably would not have recognized as relevant, any more than Anderson would have, although Anderson is still alive and has lived long enough that he's writing a commentary on Genesis. I mean, this is what happens if you live long enough in life, I suppose. Rentorf's point was that von Rad had a view of the Old Testament that moved from the Hexateuch. The Hexateuch would be the Pentateuch plus Joshua and Judges, on the theory that the sources of the Pentateuch didn't end with the Pentateuch, but went into Joshua. And Rentorf noted that von Rad moved from the Hexateuch, not to the prophets, the second division, but into categories that he invented. One of them was called the anointed of Yahweh. And then the third category was Israel's answer. This included the wisdom literature, something like that. And volume 2, the second volume, finally treated the prophets and concluded with a section on the Old Testament and the New Testament. It should be further noted that in the section Israel's Answer, von Rad's Part 2, he included the Deuteronomistic and the chronistic histories, that is, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and Chronicles. What Rentorf failed to note in sufficient detail was not just that von Rad's account was or one might even say non-canonical. Rather, in adopting this particular schema, Hexateuch, Israel's Answer, the anointed of Yahweh, the prophets, von Rad actually reproduced something of the order of English printed Bibles, although not perfectly. Isn't that fascinating there? Because von Rad would have been astounded if you had told him, at the end of the day, pal, all you really did was reproduce this order and snazz it up with some Hexateuch, Yahwist, and so forth and so on. Rentorf also pointed out that von Rad's efforts to link the prophets with the law, this was something von Rad was concerned. Law had been placed late in Israel's history. Prophets were seen as the foundation. But however much von Rad tried to show that the prophets were indebted to the law, by virtue of putting them last in his treatment, he succeeded in pulling the law and the prophets as far apart as possible. And this is a legacy that lives on today. A prophetic ministry is something that has nothing to do with foundations, law, institutions, nothing. A prophetic ministry is what somebody has when they're against all of those things, right? I mean, I have a prophetic ministry. Well, that means I don't know, I'm standing with Martin Luther King or somebody like that by my own estimate. Well, in reality, the law and the prophets, according to the canonical division, had a reciprocal relationship, very tight and closely knit one with another. Childs presented then in 1979 a course correction. I want to call attention primarily to the developments in the prophetic division of the canon. As I've already indicated in passing, Childs reinstated a concern with the tripartite order for historical and for practical reasons. I've already called attention to the way he stressed the function of Deuteronomy in the formation of the Pentateuch, which not only showed how the law was to address future generations. What else did it famously do? It intimated an order of prophets who would follow Moses in Deuteronomy 18. Therefore, intimated the development that is pursued in Torah, prophets, and writings. In reality, though, Childs was aware of and noted that the prophetic division of the canon is itself a very complex creation. The most obvious challenge in the prophetic division was the decision to merge a former and a latter prophetic witness, the first consisting in large measure of continuous narrative, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. For the most part, however, this classification of the prophets also, and I suppose most fundamentally on our imaginations, evokes the 3 major prophets and the 12 minor prophets, those that we really think of as prophetic works. This conjunction, according to Childs, of the former and the latter prophets was an achievement of no small proportion. I'll deal in detail tomorrow with the theological implications of this form. Childs and others went a long way toward explaining how this conjunction of the former and the latter prophets effected a particular understanding, self-understanding of Israel's literature. When it comes to the minor prophets, this one section here, the 12 minor prophets, beginning with Hosea and ending with Malachi, as I said, Childs offers only small hints of the relationship of these books one to another. He also paid attention in the book of the 12 to the hermeneutical function of strange features that one finds in these 12 minor prophets. So he would ask questions, not how is a psalm extraneous in the book of Jonah? You have Jonah going into the whale and uttering a psalm of thanksgiving. That doesn't make any sense. Let's take it out. Childs' reaction was, no, let's leave it there and ask what its hermeneutical function is in the present shape of the book of Jonah. It's not just take it out because you shouldn't be giving thanks in the belly of a whale and if you haven't been spit out on the shore yet. Let's ask what a psalm of thanksgiving is doing in the present book of Jonah, rather than saying it's secondary or third or level or so forth and so on. Similar questions Childs raised. Why is there a psalm in the book of Habakkuk? Why does the prophet Habakkuk end with this famous psalm? Why do Micah and Isaiah have overlapping material? Now in the latter days, the house of the mountain of the Lord will be lifted up above all the mountains. An exact replica of Isaiah 2. Why? Instead of asking, is this a secondary or tertiary level in the book, is the implication that we're meant to read Micah and Isaiah in relationship to one another? Amos ends with on a very strange note. I will utterly destroy the house of Israel, yet I won't utterly do it. I think the easy way to handle that thing is, secondary gloss, wanted to make things a little happy ending and so forth. The problem is that the book doesn't end on a happy ending. So this is the kind of question Childs would raise by trying to pay attention to the final form of the book. So Childs in his reading began to see associations in the literature at a different level, in terms of the way the historical prophet was related by editors to future generations, so that the future generations could interpret and hear a historical message from the past, but shaping their present experience. This is what Psalms do. They release a historical message from the past in order to arc over to the present day. Psalms have this effect. They involve us, as it were, in the experience of Israel. A new picture then is opening up, unforeseen in Childs' 1979 introduction. And this work will begin to take a particular focus on the Book of the 12. The minor prophets have a high degree of cross-fertilization, a high degree of stitching and association in their present final form. The prophets then are not simply an effort to render individual witnesses in their historical order, but rather to place them in such a way that they may be appropriated by successive generations. And this inquiry will extend for Childs finally also into the New Testament. Why are there so many and not so many other letters of Paul? Why is Romans the first letter of the Pauline letter collection? You can begin to see, once you begin asking these questions, you can see that there is a relationship between the kinds of issues that are related to the Old Testament and also then in the canonical form of the New Testament as well. Why is Luke and Acts separated by the Gospel of John, and what is the effect of the form? It will not be my intention to explain all of Childs' work, but to move on and to raise the issues that are now of importance in the Book of the 12. And I'll be doing that tomorrow. By treating the prophets in the order of the Masoretic text, it will be possible to tease out the implications of the resistance of the order of the 12, finally, to any serious modification, even in our printed English Bibles. Though there is an alternative order of the Book of the 12 preserved in some of the Septuagint manuscripts, by and large, the order with which we are familiar, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, has been preserved without much resistance. Secondly, the question will be posed, why the consolidation of this minor prophet collection with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel? And what about the curiosity of the book of Daniel that I know Glenn is working on? Why did this book float in the canon, sometimes associating itself with Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel? But in most Hebrew listings, most indeed all that we have in large measure that are familiar to us, Daniel is a wise man who lives in the company of the writings. Why? Why? Daniel is, of course, not called a prophet, but that still begs a question as to why he has not found his place in the accomplishment of the prophetic division of the canon. And finally, tomorrow as well, what did it mean to create a prophetic division that conjoined historical or narrative books, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, with the major and minor prophets, the 3 and the 12? If we can better understand this consolidation effort, we might then begin to understand the logic of this disparate 3-division canon, and also why decisions were made in the fourfold to allow books to migrate. By what principles of migration was this particular tripartite form taken apart and rearranged? One of the questions, it's not unlike one of my graduate students has used the image of gravity in a planetary system. Certain smaller books seem to have the ability to move without disturbing, it'll be my argument, the logic of the law and the prophets. Particularly, just to refresh your memory on this, we have to be concerned with Lamentations, which tends to move toward Jeremiah, Ruth, which tends to move towards Joshua and Judges, Daniel, which tends to move toward the prophetic canon in some orders, Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, which leave the writings and become associated with these kindred books of the former prophets, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings. So what I hope I've done tonight at least is to at least raise the question of the propriety of the form of the material, and tomorrow I will pursue a little bit more what I regard as the chief accomplishment, which is this prophetic canonical accomplishment. Thank you for your patience, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
We will entertain a few questions. This evening, since it is being recorded, we are going to make use of the microphones. And so we have one back here, and this will be taken from me from time to time. And if you're asking a question, please wait until the microphone is shoved in front of your face, okay? And don't hold it up too close because they are sensitive. Are there questions then?
Good.
Thank you. I just want to know from just my knowledge of Canon, and that is quite limited, but I just want to know, not so much on a personal level, but what would that mean for the layman? What's the reason why you are putting so much effort into finding out the true order or what have you? Do you understand what I'm trying to ask?
Yeah, When 2 Timothy says all Scripture is inspired of God and useful for instruction, the implication, it seems to me, of all Scripture has to do with the way anyone thinks about the relationship between books of the Bible. I, for example, am in a tradition where on Sunday morning lessons are paired or tripled with one another. That creates an effect. So I'll be preaching on Wednesday, and we're hearing Ruth, and we're hearing the cleansing of the lepers. Only one comes back and gives thanks. You create an effect when you associate books with one another. And the Bible, in my judgment, means to create and evoke a nexus of interpretation. The alternative is, I think, in the tradition of the church, worrisome, because texts get divorced from their contexts, literary and canonical, and then only function with respect to the reader and his or her circumstances, which is one aspect to Scripture's ability to speak and enclose the believer, the reader, the inquirer. But the key thing of the Bible is its internal relationship, and that aspect has fallen out, it seems to be, in a lot of teaching. So any interpretation of a biblical text requires one to know in relationship to what other biblical texts. I can't imagine reading the Bible, except in some fairly narrow proof texting kind of way, without raising the question of literary relationship. And presumably, it'd be my judgment that Luke, for example, in the case of the New Testament, has meaningfully arranged the way the narrative goes. Why do you have 4 sayings? Or why do you have this miracle story? And why do you have that one? Why do you move into a part of Luke where you're concerned with the second coming? So any effort to interpret the Bible has to do with how it relates to itself in some form or other. So I don't know whether that answers the question, but I can't imagine any effort to interpret the Bible without some grid of understanding or association to help you. And my point is that those who went before us have actually anticipated our need for that construction in some way. The alternative is this historical way of interpreting, which makes you try to figure out where Amos was in time and place and so forth and so on. Those are all very useful, but it's not really getting at, to my mind, the way these prophets have been associated one with another. And I'll speak to that a little bit tomorrow. Let me give you one example, which I don't think I'll steal from tomorrow. Amos, as we know, is very interested in social criticism, the poor, the lack of attention to the poor, and that this is the reason why the northern kingdom is falling. Hosea's concern is actually not very much with that. It's with false worship, with idolatry, with infidelity, with faithlessness, and so forth and so on. It seems to me that the pupils of these two prophets want us to understand the relationship between these two things, between false worship, unfaithfulness, and the way we discharge our finances and the way we handle money in the world and the way we care for our neighbors. And if you try to hear these themes apart from one another, you're not actually hearing the way they related one to another. And I think basically then you say, well, I kind of like Amos, but I'm not a big fan of Hosea's or something like that. Or that applies, but that doesn't apply. It seems to me that the pupils who work on these books actually don't want you to draw those kinds of conclusions. They want you to see the relationship between these themes.
If we have been focusing on the canonization of the Old Testament, and to the extent that you've just brought in the passage in Timothy, where all Scripture is for teaching and God-breathed, what is the underlying theme then that determines the fact that the exactness of canonization is the important issue? And that's the first question. And secondly, if we looked at the JPD, if we looked at whether Moses is the sole author of the Pentateuch, is it not more important to view Moses as a pen, or the exactness of the Pentateuch as the paper on which it was written, as opposed to the fact that it's very important to determine that he was the author of the Pentateuch?
I'm not entirely sure. Let me try to pick up the second part of the question. Maybe I missed it a bit. Is it more important that we understand the implications of the present form and thrust of a narrative that begins with creation, the calling of Israel's experience in the wilderness and so forth? Is that more important than determining whether or not Moses wrote the Pentateuch or not? Yes. And it doesn't seem to me that the Mosaic authorship of the Pentateuch ever was a claim to the kind of authorship that's being implied often by the conservative concern at that point. I just don't think it's a concept of authorship that existed in antiquity. I just think it was. I think to say that something was Mosaic or Isaianic was to urge the reader toward an understanding of coherence, such as would be implied by a single mind at work in the material. So in the book of Isaiah, I don't try to argue for Isaiah wrote the book of Isaiah, but what I do try to argue is that the Isaianic authorship is an appeal to the reader to see coherence and not division. It's to seek a unitary understanding.
So then let's make the assumption then that we have it wrong.
What assumption?
Let's say that the canonization of as we know it today is incorrect.
Give me an example. I'd have to know what.
Well,
that books were left out that should be in, or what?
Sure, and maybe we have them in the wrong order, and as such, we obviously look at the book of Genesis as by nature the beginning, as by nature the first book, and so on and so forth. But let's argue the point that it is wrong. Maybe Genesis shouldn't be the first book.
Well, one of the things I'll try to show in the last lecture is that the divergence of these forms merely asks us to have an explanation to hand. It's not to necessarily say that one is decisive for our interpretation. Now, I take that view over against a number of people, John Sailhammer, Roger Beckwith, and others, who are so fixated on the form being absolutely settled that it seems to me that they've missed what it means for the church to have a varied form of the canon and to be able to live quite comfortably with that. My point, though, not to anticipate too much, is that one needs to understand why moves have been made in order not to make false assumptions. A false assumption, I think, is that this order leans into the new because the prophets are last. I think that's wrong. I just don't think there's anything to that. I don't think there ever was in antiquity either. Not least because we don't have any, as I said, we don't have an order like this in antiquity. Now, your other question seems to me is a slightly different one. That is, so on the one hand, I don't want to say there's only one fixed order. What I want to say is that there are a variety of orders whose interpretation is crucial, but there's not a single order. But you can't leave a consideration of form and order out of your interpretation of text. I just don't think you can do it. I think we've tried, for a couple hundred years, I think the thing races back in at the end anyway. Or you turn the Bible into a consumer project. You have likes and dislikes. You have some people you like better than others. That's called canon within canon. Lutherans made a kind of career out of this in a way, and others have done a similar thing. I would rather try to hear the parts of the Bible symphonically. I don't want to hear a piccolo all day long, but a piccolo is part of the orchestra. And I don't want to say I prefer wind over piccolo. I want to figure out how this field of association lets the full voice of God be sounded. Now, I'm as concerned to protect that as I am to say what it means. Because the alternative I do not like, which tends to be consumeristic. Is that? But I don't think, on your question, does it matter that Genesis is first? You're darn right it does. I mean, there's some things, it seems to me, that are just inviolable. And if you begin to lose that, you have difficulty relating, for example, how the call of Israel is related to the Creator God, the maker of heaven and earth, and His plans for all creation. You got to backdoor that in rather than saying this is at the front end of the project. It'd be that kind of thing.
Which again,
we're going to have to allow for some other questions.
I mean, they're good. I mean, this is very, very helpful to me because I think otherwise there's a certain sterility, I suspect, about just talking about form. You've got to tease out the implications of this.
Yeah. There will, by the way, be a talkback session tomorrow at which we will have a lot more time to
do this
talk
kind of
about some issues.
But
So
please,
we'll
yeah.
spread the questions around a bit.
It's often been said that you learn from history. And the question I'd like to ask you is, what we're presently seeing in the journalists and news broadcasts of what's happening in the world today, that there are those who try to present the facts as best they can and relate those facts to past history and show the result of what happened in past history is happening today. Now, there are other journalists who give an interpretation.
Spot on.
There are other journalists who give an interpretation, and a lot of it's subjective, and draw their own conclusions about the similarities between which are not as similar as they would make them out to be because they don't stay to the facts of what has been in either case. And I'm wondering if what you're saying is that in the past there are facts there that apply to life whether it was then or now, but they have to be in relationship one to the other.
That's very good. That's exactly what I'm saying. And that there is a naive search for facts that involves separating a witness from its field of association. And I think what we've begun to discover is that there is no uninterpreted history. On the other hand, there is history. There is a realist account of things that happen, but that account is always refracted through a witness. And it seems to me that, again, not to get into the philosophical problem here, but that Christian faith is almost without remainder a faith of testifying and witnessing to something. And I think when people tried to take Christian faith into the area of the whole problem of Christian faith is the problem of the lack of proximity, temporal proximity. They've missed something. Because the problem of our relationship to a prophet or to Jesus is handled by the Bible's form. That's what it means to have John last, to my mind, in the Gospels, because John's position is trying to broker the earthly Jesus to a next generation of faith, just like Deuteronomy does. And what I hear John repeatedly saying is, had you been there on the spot, your eyes would have been clouded. Proximity, you can get too close to a thing. You can't see it anymore. And I think the modern mind is obsessed with the notion that if we had facts or if we could get on top of the matter, everything would come clear. There's a certain amount of truth in that. And falsehood has to be decried all the time. On the other hand, the New Testament speaks of the Holy Spirit's ability to bring something to life from the past. And the canonical process, I think, sees that and assists with it. But your question is very good. It's a tightrope. Christians believe that Jesus Christ died under Pontius Pilate. It wasn't Groundhog Day or something like that. But he also died in accordance with a plan from long ago. And that's why that day was crucial, and that's why the Old Testament is crucial in an account of what that's about.
One more question.
When talking about your prophets section there, which I'm well aware of, I'm wondering, when we see that list of former prophets, partly because we're raised in Protestant churches, we think those are history books,
Right.
or the latter, those are prophetic books. So what was it back then when they were grouped rather early? We see it in the New Testament. What was the unifying factor? What made Joshua similar to Isaiah and similar to Amos?
This is the question. I mean, this is what I'm trying to puzzle out, and I'll do a little bit with it tomorrow. But this is precisely the issue. What is it about prophecy that both contains a concern with narrative and history telling, but also admits of this peculiarity of the Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12? Why are both of those seen as prophetic and not broken up? And in part, I don't want to go into my lecture for tomorrow, but you're seeing the point. And I think what happens in this order is that this order, in some ways, doesn't appreciate the achievement here, and begins to construct new categories. Now, I said I did not want to run this order down. I think it has to be explained. The easiest thing to be said is that, one of the things that's often said is, this order wants the prophetical last so that it leans into the new. It's a more Christian order. The problem with this is that this order is not necessarily Christian. The Septuagint goes back to a Jewish order. Moreover, it may well be that this is the source of the problem. That having construed these books as historical, you've begun to think about the matter in terms of types of literature, rather than some way in which Israel was seeking to understand prophecy differently. Now, but you're on the right track there, and I'll probably do a baleful job tomorrow trying to understand that. On the last day, what I'm going to do is, this is for me the real mystery, these books. Because on the one hand, they're a library. They don't seem to have any internal associations like here and there. I think Glenn's been working this. On the other hand, there's something there's a real genius to this order that allows the books to migrate on occasion, as they do, but also has its own integrity. I think it's more than just a diverse library of books. But you've asked the right question.
And that's a wonderful place to finish off this evening. Let's give them a round of applause.
Thank you. That's for your